On a quiet night in May of 2019, in a small town where everyone knew each other, a family secret turned deadly. Daniel and Diana Harper, twins who had always been inseparable, were about to be at the center of a tragedy that no one saw coming. At 28 years old, they were successful, well-liked, and shared a bond that was stronger than most siblings. But behind their perfect smiles and loving personalities, there was something much darker. Their father, Anthony Harper, found dead in his own home, had everyone asking one question: who would want to harm a man so respected by the community? The truth would shock even the closest of friends and leave a lasting scar on the town. As investigators dug deeper, a chilling discovery came to light: a secret pact between the twins, one that would tie them together in a way no one expected. What started as a close family connection spiraled into jealousy, betrayal, and ultimately murder. Detective Olivia Marshall, a veteran on the force, led the investigation, uncovering clues and connections that left her team speechless. The more she learned, the more twisted the story became. What led to this horrifying crime? How did a family that seemed so perfect on the outside hide such dangerous secrets? And why would two people, bound by blood, make a choice that ended in such a brutal way? This is the story of how a pact between twins turned into a nightmare. Let's get into the details and uncover what really went down. On a cold night in late April 2019, in the small town of Redwood Falls, something terrible happened. A man named Anthony Harper was found dead in his own home. Anthony was a well-respected man in the town, known by many as a kind and hard-working father. He lived with his two grown children, twins named Daniel and Diana Harper. The three of them had always been close, with the twins especially known for their deep bond. But, as the story unfolded, that close bond was hiding a dark secret. The night of the murder, everything seemed calm and quiet. Redwood Falls was a town where most people kept to themselves, and not much happened outside the usual daily routines. But that night at around 11 p.m., Anthony's neighbor noticed something strange. The lights in Anthony's house were all on, and his car was parked in the driveway, which wasn't unusual. But the neighbor found it odd that the back door was wide open. This wasn't normal for Anthony, who was known to be careful and meticulous. The neighbor, an older man named George, decided to walk over and check if everything was all right. When George entered the house through the back door, he noticed that the kitchen was unusually messy. Dishes were still on the table, and it looked like someone had left in a hurry. As he walked further into the house, George started to call out for Anthony, but there was no answer. The house was eerily silent. George made his way into the living room and stopped dead in his tracks. There, lying face down on the carpet, was Anthony Harper. His body was still, and a pool of blood had formed around his head. George immediately rushed outside, shaking, and called the police. When the police arrived, they quickly determined that Anthony had been dead for at least a couple of hours. The scene was disturbing, with clear signs of a violent struggle. Anthony had been hit multiple times, and the blows had been so severe that they killed him. The officers cordoned off the area, and soon, Detective Olivia Marshall arrived at the scene. She was a seasoned investigator, known for her sharp instincts and no-nonsense approach. As she began examining the crime scene, it became clear that this wasn't a simple robbery or random attack. There was no sign of forced entry, and nothing of value seemed to be missing. It was clear that whoever had done this knew Anthony and wanted him dead. Detective Marshall's first step was to speak with the twins, Daniel and Diana. They were both home when the body was discovered but claimed they hadn't heard anything. Daniel, visibly shaken, told the detective that he had been upstairs in his room watching TV and didn't notice anything until the police arrived. Diana, on the other hand, said she had gone for a walk earlier in the evening and only came home after the house was already filled with officers. Both of them seemed deeply upset by their father's death, but there was something about their stories that didn't sit right with Detective Marshall. The timeline of events was fuzzy, and there was something off about the way they spoke about their father. As the investigation continued, Marshall began to dig deeper into the family's history. On the outside, the Harper family seemed perfect. Anthony had raised the twins alone after their mother passed away when they were young. He had worked hard to give them everything they needed, and they were known around town as a close-knit family. But as Marshall uncovered more about their past, cracks started to show in that perfect image. It turned out that Daniel and Diana's relationship with their father hadn't always been smooth. There were rumors that Anthony had been strict, almost controlling, especially when it came to their personal lives. Daniel had tried to start his own business but failed, and Anthony wasn't shy about his disappointment. Diana had been engaged to a man named Ryan, but the relationship fell apart under mysterious circumstances. Some said that Anthony had never approved of the engagement, and his interference had led to the breakup. As Detective Marshall learned more, she became convinced that the answer to Anthony's murder lay within the family itself. There was no sign of a break-in, and nothing pointed to an outside attacker. It had to be someone who knew the layout of the house, someone who could get in and out without raising suspicion. As she pieced together the events of that night, one thing became clear: Daniel and Diana were hiding something. The next step was to gather more evidence. Marshall had her team comb through the house for any clues that might have been missed. They checked for fingerprints, analyzed the blood splatter, and searched for any signs of who might have attacked Anthony. Meanwhile, the twins were questioned again, this time separately. Marshall knew that if they were hiding something, their stories would eventually fall apart under pressure. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that this wasn't just a case of a simple family tragedy. Something much darker was at play, and the more Marshall uncovered, the more disturbing the truth seemed to be. Anthony Harper's death wasn't random. It was the result of a carefully orchestrated plan, one that involved betrayal, deceit, and a pact between two people who were supposed to love him most. By the end of the first week, Detective Marshall had enough information to believe that the twins knew more than they were letting on. Now, it was just a matter of time before the truth came out. The question wasn't just who had killed Anthony Harper, but why. And the answer to that question would turn the entire town of Redwood Falls upside down. As the investigation into Anthony Harper's death continued, Detective Olivia Marshall began to focus more on the behavior of the twins, Daniel and Diana. The police had already ruled out the possibility of a random break-in, and it was becoming clearer that the murder had been committed by someone who had easy access to the house. Daniel and Diana were both questioned multiple times, but their stories didn't seem to match up perfectly. Each time they were asked about the events of the night, small details would change, making the detective even more suspicious. While both twins had alibis, they weren't airtight. Daniel had claimed he was in his room the entire evening watching TV, but when the police checked his phone records, it showed that he had made several calls to someone around the time of the murder. Diana's story was even more puzzling. She said she had gone out for a walk, but no one in the neighborhood had seen her during the time she was supposed to have been outside. Detective Marshall knew she was dealing with a complicated case, but the more she learned about the family, the more convinced she became that the twins were hiding something. As she dug deeper into the family's past, more troubling details began to surface. Anthony Harper had always been a strict and demanding father. He pushed both Daniel and Diana to be perfect in everything they did, from school to their personal lives. But the pressure had caused problems over the years. Daniel, who had tried to start his own business, was constantly under the shadow of his father's expectations. When his business failed, Anthony wasn't supportive. Instead, he blamed Daniel for not trying hard enough, creating a lot of tension between them. Diana, on the other hand, had struggled with her personal relationships. Her father's disapproval of her fiancé had caused a major rift, and the engagement had eventually ended. Friends of the family started coming forward, telling the police that despite their public image, the Harpers were far from perfect. Several people mentioned that Daniel and Diana had always seemed overly dependent on each other, even as adults. The twins shared a bond that went beyond normal sibling relationships. They were always together, rarely seen apart, and it was clear that their father's controlling nature had affected them deeply. It wasn't long before the police uncovered more troubling information about the twins. They had started acting out in their teenage years, getting into trouble with the law for minor offenses. Anthony had always managed to cover up their mistakes, keeping the family's reputation intact. But the police now had a clearer picture of the tension that had been building up for years. Daniel's failed business, Diana's broken engagement, and Anthony's constant criticism had created a toxic environment in the household. Detective Marshall began to suspect that the twins might have been involved in their father's death, but she needed more evidence to prove it. She decided to have a closer look at Daniel's and Diana's financial records, hoping to find something that might shed light on their motives. What she found was shocking. Both twins were heavily in debt, something they had kept hidden from everyone, including their father. Daniel's failed business had left him with thousands of dollars in loans, while Diana had accumulated significant credit card debt after her engagement ended. Despite their financial troubles, Anthony had refused to help them, further straining their relationship. With this new information, Detective Marshall started piecing together a possible motive for the murder. The twins had been struggling financially for years, and their father's refusal to help had likely caused resentment to build up. Anthony's death would not only free them from his control, but they would also inherit his substantial estate, which could solve all their problems. This theory started to make sense, but Marshall knew she needed more concrete evidence before she could make any arrests. The next step was to re-examine the crime scene. Forensic experts had already collected all the physical evidence, but there was one piece that hadn't been fully explored: Anthony's phone. The detectives retrieved the phone from the evidence room and started looking through his messages and call logs. They found several angry texts exchanged between Anthony and Daniel in the days leading up to the murder. In these messages, Anthony had scolded Daniel for his failures and demanded that he take responsibility for his life. There were also messages from Diana, pleading with her father to be more understanding and to help them financially, but Anthony had refused. These messages painted a clear picture of the strained relationship between the father and his children. But the breakthrough came when the police discovered a deleted voice message from the night of the murder. In the message, Anthony could be heard arguing with someone in the house. The voice was muffled, but it sounded like Daniel. The message cut off suddenly, leaving the police to believe that this was when the attack had taken place. With this new piece of evidence, Detective Marshall decided it was time to confront the twins again. She called them in for separate interviews, hoping that one of them would crack under pressure. During Daniel's interview, he remained calm at first, but when confronted with the financial records and the deleted message, his demeanor changed. He became defensive and agitated, refusing to answer further questions. Meanwhile, Diana's interview took a different turn. She broke down in tears, insisting that they hadn't meant for things to go this far. It was clear that the police were getting closer to the truth. But Marshall knew that in order to close the case, she needed a confession or undeniable proof that tied the twins to the murder. The investigation had reached a critical point. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but there were still unanswered questions. How had the twins managed to keep their plan hidden for so long? And what exactly had happened on the night Anthony Harper was killed? The next steps would reveal the full extent of the twins' pact, and the truth would be more shocking than anyone could have imagined. As the investigation continued, Detective Olivia Marshall grew more certain that Daniel and Diana were hiding key information about their father's murder. With the financial records and deleted voice message pointing toward a possible motive, she knew she had to tighten the circle around the twins. Her goal was to uncover exactly what had happened on that night, and whether the two of them had acted together, or if one was more involved than the other. Detective Marshall decided to take a closer look at the timeline of events on the night of Anthony's murder. She went through security camera footage from nearby homes and businesses. Redwood Falls wasn't a big town, and not many homes had cameras, but one neighbor down the street had a camera that faced the road. This footage captured a glimpse of the twins' house around the time of the murder. Marshall carefully reviewed the footage. It was hard to make out much in the dark, but she could clearly see a person walking out of the Harper house and then quickly coming back about 20 minutes later. The person was wearing a hooded jacket, but the build and height matched Diana's description. This piece of evidence didn't place her away from the crime scene as she had claimed in her original alibi. With this new information, Marshall returned to question Diana once again. This time, Diana's story began to shift. She admitted that she had left the house for a brief walk, but didn't want to admit it earlier because she had been dealing with a personal issue. Diana insisted that her leaving had nothing to do with her father's death. She claimed that when she came back, everything seemed normal, and she had gone straight to bed, unaware of the horror that had occurred in the living room. Detective Marshall, though, was not convinced. There was too much circumstantial evidence that didn't add up. Diana's presence outside the house during the crucial moments, her inconsistent alibi, and the tension between her and her father all pointed to a much deeper involvement. Still, there was one more person to interrogate: Daniel. Daniel, on the other hand, had been silent since his last interview, where he had become defensive and refused to answer questions. Marshall knew that getting him to open up would require a different approach. She decided to confront him with the new information she had gathered, hoping to push him toward a confession or to reveal a crack in his story. When Marshall met with Daniel again, she presented the timeline, showing him the gaps in his alibi and the inconsistencies with Diana's statements. At first, Daniel remained calm, but as the detective laid out the evidence, his demeanor began to shift. He became more agitated and started asking for details about what Diana had told the police. It was clear that Daniel was worried, not just about his involvement but also about how much Diana had said. Marshall began to suspect that there was more going on between the twins than just a shared bond. The pressure of their father's expectations, their financial troubles, and the strain of keeping secrets seemed to be driving a wedge between them. Slowly, the detective started to understand that the twins had made a pact that would ultimately lead to their father's death. The investigation then turned toward gathering more physical evidence. Marshall sent her team back to the Harper house to re-examine the crime scene, focusing on anything that might have been overlooked. During this second sweep, one of the forensic experts found something crucial: a set of fingerprints on the murder weapon, a heavy metal object that had been used to strike Anthony. The prints belonged to Daniel. This discovery changed everything. With Daniel's fingerprints on the murder weapon, the police had undeniable proof that he had been directly involved in his father's death. But the question remained, was this an act committed by Daniel alone, or had Diana played a part as well? The bond between the twins was strong, but could it have been strong enough to plan and carry out a murder together? Marshall confronted Daniel with the evidence. This time, he couldn't stay silent. Faced with the fingerprint evidence, he broke down and admitted that he had struck his father in a fit of rage. Daniel explained that the argument between him and his father had spiraled out of control. Anthony had once again belittled him for his failures, calling him a disappointment. In that moment, years of anger and resentment boiled over, and Daniel lashed out, grabbing the nearest object and hitting his father. However, Daniel insisted that Diana hadn't been involved. According to him, she wasn't even in the house at the time of the attack. But Detective Marshall wasn't sure she could believe him. Diana's behavior and the evidence of her movements on the night of the murder still pointed to her involvement, whether directly or indirectly. The confession from Daniel provided a major breakthrough in the case, but Marshall knew there was still more to uncover. Daniel's story of acting alone didn't completely fit with what the evidence suggested. The deleted voice message from Anthony's phone, the financial troubles both twins had, and Diana's shifting alibi all indicated that the murder was more than just a crime of passion. It was beginning to look like it was part of a planned act between the two siblings, an act that would rid them of the controlling figure in their lives and give them access to their father's wealth. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Detective Marshall focused on finding the final pieces of the puzzle. She needed to determine how much Diana knew and if the twins had truly been working together from the start. The evidence was slowly building, but there was still one last thing Marshall needed before she could close the case: a full confession from both Daniel and Diana. The case had now reached a critical stage, with the truth on the verge of being fully revealed. The question of whether the twins had acted alone or together would soon be answered, but the answer would shock everyone involved in the investigation. As Detective Olivia Marshall worked through the final stages of the investigation, the pressure mounted. Daniel had confessed to striking his father, but the evidence suggested something more complex than just a heated argument. There was still the issue of Diana's involvement, and it was becoming increasingly clear that this was not just a spontaneous act of violence. The truth behind Anthony Harper's murder seemed to be tied to years of tension and a possible premeditated plan between the twins. After Daniel's partial confession, Marshall decided to take another look at Diana. Her shifting alibi and the footage of her leaving the house on the night of the murder continued to raise red flags. The detective began to focus on the relationship between the twins, suspecting that Diana had played a much larger role than she had admitted. Marshall and her team dug further into Diana's background. They interviewed more friends and acquaintances, hoping to uncover any details that might reveal the nature of her relationship with Daniel. It became clear that the bond between the siblings was strong, but it also seemed unusually intense. Friends mentioned that the twins had always relied on each other, often keeping secrets and distancing themselves from others. They seemed to form a tight, insular world that few people could penetrate. The police also began examining the financial situation in more detail. While Daniel's debts were substantial, Diana's financial troubles were equally concerning. She had been living beyond her means for years, racking up credit card debt and failing to pay off loans. The added stress of their father's strict control over their finances only heightened the suspicion that the twins had planned to benefit from Anthony's death. Marshall knew that in order to make the case airtight, she needed to gather more concrete evidence linking Diana to the murder. Her team continued to comb through phone records, emails, and any other digital traces left behind. It was during this search that they uncovered a series of text messages exchanged between Daniel and Diana in the weeks leading up to the murder. The messages hinted at growing frustration with their father, with both siblings expressing a desire to be free from his control. The texts alone weren't enough to prove a murder plot, but they painted a clearer picture of the strained relationship between the siblings and their father. They also suggested that the murder wasn't a sudden act of rage, but rather something that had been brewing for some time. Detective Marshall's breakthrough came when one of the forensic investigators made a critical discovery. While re-examining Diana's personal belongings, they found a hidden journal in her bedroom. The journal contained entries that revealed Diana's increasing anger toward her father and her feelings of being trapped under his control. More disturbingly, one of the final entries mentioned a pact she had made with Daniel. The entry was vague, but it referenced a plan to finally be free from Anthony's control. This journal entry was the missing piece Marshall had been looking for. It confirmed her suspicions that the twins had been working together, and that the murder was not just the result of a heated argument. It was part of a larger calculated plan to remove the man who had controlled their lives for so long. Armed with this evidence, Marshall was now ready to confront Diana and bring the investigation to a close. Marshall called Diana in for one final interrogation. This time she presented the journal, the text messages, and the footage showing Diana leaving the house on the night of the murder. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, Diana's resolve began to crumble. She denied involvement at first, but the pressure was too much. Eventually she admitted that she had known about Daniel's plan to confront their father and that she had left the house that night on purpose, hoping to distance herself from the crime. However, Diana insisted that she hadn't expected things to escalate to murder. She claimed that Daniel had acted alone in the actual killing, but her admission of knowing about the plan tied her directly to the crime. The police now had enough to arrest both Daniel and Diana for their roles in their father's murder. As the twins were taken into custody, the full scope of the crime became clear. The tension between them and their father had been building for years, fueled by financial stress, personal failures, and Anthony's strict control over their lives. The murder was the culmination of this pressure, a desperate attempt by the twins to free themselves from their father's influence and gain control of the family's wealth. Daniel and Diana had formed a pact, driven by their shared frustrations and desire for independence. But what they hadn't anticipated was the devastating consequences of their actions. Their plan, which had seemed like the only way out, had led to the brutal murder of their father and the unraveling of their lives. Detective Marshall's investigation had uncovered the dark truth behind the Harper family's seemingly perfect image. What had once looked like an accidental or impulsive crime was now revealed to be a calculated, cold-blooded act of desperation. With the case now closed, Marshall reflected on how easily a family could fall apart under the weight of secrets and lies. The twins would soon face justice for their roles in the murder, but the scars left behind by their actions would take far longer to heal. After both Daniel and Diana were arrested, the town of Redwood Falls was in shock. No one could have imagined that the well-liked twins, who seemed so close, could be involved in something so terrible. The courtroom was packed when the trial began, as everyone wanted to know how the case would unfold and if the twins would be held accountable for their father's murder. The prosecution presented the evidence in a clear and straightforward manner. Daniel's fingerprints on the murder weapon and his confession about the argument with his father were crucial. His admission that he struck Anthony in a fit of rage left little room for doubt about his direct involvement. The prosecution also focused on the financial struggles that both Daniel and Diana had been facing. They argued that these pressures, combined with their father's strict control over their lives, had led the twins to plot Anthony's murder. Diana's role in the crime was harder to prove. Although she hadn't physically attacked her father, the evidence showed she had been deeply involved in planning the murder. The journal entries, the text messages between her and Daniel, and the footage showing her leaving the house at the critical time were presented to the jury. The prosecution painted a picture of a pact between the twins, driven by frustration, resentment, and a desire for freedom from their father's control. The defense, however, tried to argue that the murder had not been planned. They claimed that Daniel had acted alone in a moment of uncontrollable anger, and that Diana hadn't known her brother would go that far. They insisted that Diana's role was more passive, that she had been frustrated with their father but had never intended for him to be killed. The defense tried to cast doubt on the extent of Diana's involvement, suggesting that her actions after the murder were more about fear and shock than guilt. As the trial went on, the jury listened to the details of the twins' complicated relationship with their father. The defense attempted to show that Anthony had been a controlling and overbearing figure in their lives, which had put immense pressure on the twins. But the prosecution remained focused on the cold facts, the financial motive, the premeditation hinted at in their communications, and the way the twins had tried to cover up the crime afterward. When it came time for the jury to deliberate, the evidence against Daniel was overwhelming. His confession, combined with his fingerprints on the murder weapon, led to a swift decision. Daniel was found guilty of first-degree murder, as the jury concluded that his attack on his father had been intentional and deliberate. The prosecution's argument that the murder had been the result of long-standing tension and resentment won out over the defense's claim of a spontaneous act of rage. Diana's fate, however, was less clear. After much debate, the jury found her guilty of second-degree murder. They concluded that while she may not have physically committed the murder, she had played a significant role in the planning and was aware of what was going to happen. The evidence showed that Diana had been an active participant in the events leading up to the murder, even if she hadn't directly killed her father. With the verdict delivered, Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Diana, given her lesser charge, received a sentence of 25 years. Both would spend the rest of their lives dealing with the consequences of their actions, knowing that their pact had destroyed not only their father's life, but their own as well. As the case came to a close, the town of Redwood Falls was left to pick up the pieces. The trial had exposed the hidden tensions within the Harper family, showing how years of secrets, control, and frustration had led to a tragic ending. The murder of Anthony Harper would forever remain a dark chapter in the town's history, and the story of the twins' pact would be remembered as a grim reminder of how far desperation can push people. Detective Olivia Marshall, having successfully solved the case, returned to her usual work, but this one stayed with her. The Harper case wasn't just about murder, it was about family power and the unseen pressures that can build behind closed doors. It served as a reminder that even the closest bonds can break in the worst ways, leading to consequences no one could have ever imagined.